Good evening, everybody. I'm Liz Huddle, Director of Events and Marketing at Politics and Prose, and welcome to PNP Live. It's such a pleasure to welcome D'Amico Pawlewicz and Randi Weingarten tonight. For myself, like so many others, today was the first day of school in a school year that has presented unimaginable challenges. And I literally cannot think of a more crucial topic to be talking about today than the position of teachers in our society. At any point during the event, you can ask a question down at the bottom of the screen, and we'll go through as many questions as we can during the Q&A. You can also click on the link in the chat, which will come up, to purchase Blaming Teachers on PNP's website. We are an independent bookstore, and these book sales enable us to continue to bring you the programming that we are so proud of. And we desperately need sales to sustain us. So please, please do buy a book tonight. D'Amico Pawlewicz is a historian of education reform and social policy and an assistant professor in educational foundations and research at the University of North Dakota. In Blaming Teachers, she explores how professionalization reforms subverted rather than enhanced public school teachers' professional legitimacy and increased the tendency to blame teachers for the failures in public schools, leaving teachers with the worst of both worlds, in that they're held responsible as professionals for the problems of public schools, while being denied the professional and managerial authority that they need to solve those problems. Clearly, this issue has reached fever pitch in the past 6 months, and it makes this conversation tonight so crucial. She will be in conversation with Randi Weingarten, who's an American labor leader, attorney, and educator, and of course, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and a member of the AFL-CIO, and the former president of the United Federation of Teachers. Please help me welcome Diana and Randi to Politics and Prose Live.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I just want to say to start, this book has been a part of my life for a long time, and I am so thrilled to be able to share it with all of you. Thank you, Liz and Beth, for moderating and taking care of all this technology. I really thank you to all of you who are joining us this evening, especially any teachers who are logging in after a long day, maybe your first day. I'm sad that I can't see your faces and be there together, but hopefully we can hear your voices through the comments as we go, and towards the end, either questions for me or questions for Randi, or just feedback on your experiences. And thanks especially to Randi. It is just such an honor and a thrill to have the opportunity to chat with you, and I'm just excited for our conversation.
Well, I am really excited to do this with you, Diana, and I remember like reading the op-ed and saying, this really sparks to me. This really, I'm like, who wrote this? Like, what this is, and I kept on thinking, oh my God, you could see you writing. I mean, not you writing it, but you could see any teacher saying, oh yeah, I go through this craziness all the time, this kind of surrealness of being both reviled and revered all at the same time, having to figure out how to do everything and then being blamed if you can't do everything, and yet not getting paid for it and not being, not having the stature or the status. And, yet everybody knows that without teachers, we wouldn't have education and we wouldn't have the foundation of growth. So my first question is, this is your book, this is not my book. Give us an idea of why it was important for you to write it, and give us an idea about why you thought about writing it through a history lens.
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Randi. I mean, I think for me, I come from a family of educators. So for me, it's a no-brainer to understand the value of education in American history. That's kind of that's a non-starter. But for me, so what I realized very early on is if we want to understand something about American society, what we care about, what we're worried about, our hopes, our anxieties, all of that is packaged in how we talk about the schools. So I recognized that by being in the archives, really, and I had the opportunity to work with some amazing archivists, Dan at Wayne State, others at the Tamiment and NYU, all over the place, really. And being in those archives and going through these old papers, which I guess can be a solitary experience, was pretty incredible because I'm hearing the words of these teachers, of union leaders, of teacher educators, and of policymakers, having these debates and these conversations that are echoing throughout history, right? And they're different from what we are now, but also, gosh, in so many ways, they resonate into the present. So I thought that was a really important story to share. And then I think too, you know, the history of teachers is so important in this country, especially as we're thinking about the history of women in this country, right? Yeah. The history of teachers is the history of women workers. And so the ways that we regulate teachers, the ways that we deride them, all of that is a larger story about women in this country. So for all of those reasons, I kind of came to this topic. And, you know, I wrote this book. I've been working on this for over a decade. And when I was writing this, I never could have imagined COVID, that we would be, you know, facing not just COVID, but dealing again with our other sort of deep-seated American pandemic of racism and police violence, and that we would be doing all of this under the leadership of our president and Secretary of Education. So I couldn't have imagined any of that. But in so many ways, the book is kind of about this moment. You know, I think that the book helps us think about how we turn to schools to fix weighty social problems. How we expect teachers to navigate and fix problems that policymakers and politicians were unable to or punted on, but also how we keep teachers from the conversation and blame them when they speak up. So I don't know, so for all of that. Yeah, I think, Randi, if I can ask you a question.
Of course.
You know, one of the tropes I came across a lot in writing this book is teachers just need to speak up, you know? But what I found historically is that teachers have been speaking up, you know? We just really have not been very good at listening to them. You know, one story from the book that jumps out to me early on is the story of Emma Daly. Emma was a teacher in New York City in the 1920s, and she had pretty serious concerns about the principal in her school building. She just had lost her faith in his ability to lead. But she realized that speaking out at that time really could cost her job. So she kind of balanced the fear of speaking out against what she understood as her own professional responsibility. And she decided the best alternative for her was to write an anonymous letter to the superintendent of the schools. And she sent 2 letters, and she signed them a teacher from PS 38. Well, the letter made its way to the superintendent's desk, and he was enraged, like livid that somebody would write to him and make these complaints, right? And so he sent out district leaders to PS 38 to find out who this teacher was, right? Who would have the gall to do such a thing. And nobody confessed, right? All the teachers like, I don't know what you're talking about. And finally, they hired handwriting experts. And those handwriting experts identified Daly as the author of the letters, and they charged her with forgery and threatened prison time. You know, so Daly ultimately confessed and was super apologetic, and this was all over the newspapers. But the lesson was pretty clear to other teachers, you know. And I guess my question is, when you reflect on what's happening right now with reopening plans, where have teachers been in all of this?
So, you know, it's a big question. If you actually you think about what teachers did. So, you know, what teachers did in March is exactly what is expected of them.
Yeah.
Meaning that, you know, they basically, if you were in the Northeast or in the Northwest, you knew something was going on. You knew that COVID was serious. We actually, as a union, did our first press conference around it February 2nd, about that this is more than washing your hands. Yeah. You have to do more than that. And, you know, we challenged Trump to actually, it was the day of the State of the Union, to actually protect us and give us the information that we needed. I often say that every education secretary, um, Republican and Democrat alike, in the minute of great crisis, people pulled together. And I've been involved in, union officialdom for long enough to have been through many of them and many crises, from 9/11, asbestos, Ebola, MERS, SARS, swine flu, that and shootings. It didn't matter whether it was Margaret Spellings or Arnie Duncan. At the moment of great existential threat, people pulled together. This is the first time we've heard zero, not a thing from, except, taking money away from an education secretary. And I found what she said this week to be so kind of right down the alley of your book, when she said, so we did, all these teachers stopped everything, went to remote. We knew remote, we would have said pre-pandemic, as we had, that remote is not a substitute. It is a supplement to in-school learning. No one was ready. People figured it out on their own, did everything they could, and basically engaged kids all throughout the semester. Not everyone. Everyone also didn't have digital. We have huge equity issues. Tried to make stand-up eating and, grab and goes, try to stand up childcare and all of this stuff. So what did Betsy DeVos say? She says, well, these school districts didn't do very well. This is an opportunity to show how, they were stagnant. This is an opportunity to show, what that more needs to be done. If you actually simply went to YouTube or to Facebook or to Twitter or to TikTok or to Instagram, any of the social media, you could see teachers being on kids' lawns. You could see teachers trying to figure out what to do to engage kids. You could see these virtual choirs and choruses and bands and signs. We had one up about so many teachers saying, I miss you. And, so you could see the level of heart come out. But then as it came to reopening plans, we put our first one out in April. I've been trotting ours around. It's on our website, aft.org. We put ours out before anybody else. And ours was about how to reopen. And how was ours put together? Listening to epidemiologists and infectious disease docs and our leaders and our rank and file leadership from around the country, and then lots of webinars and about how to do this and whatever. But at the end of the day, what is happening in terms of reopening is that there's been a lot of responsibility pushed down on schools without the resources, without the guidance, without the plans, and without creating a real voice and agency of parents and educators about how to do this right, in terms of what do we need to do to both keep kids and our educators safe and our communities safe, and also try to engage in terms of a productive, conducive, important year of learning. And unfortunately, what's happened in the fixation on logistics and trying to have this fight about something that no one should be fighting about, public health. I'm going to end where I started. Public health should be a bipartisan issue. It should not be a political issue. Masks should not be political. You wear a mask to protect others. Yes, to protect yourself, but to protect others. You socially distance to protect others. We saw charts today from the New York Times about how we're seeing an increasing curve like this for kids who are getting COVID and spreading COVID. But teachers, by and large, just like parents, by and large, have been out of the conversation because there's not been a core of this is the guidance and this is how you implement it. We're still at the debate around the guidance when a state like Florida pretends that COVID doesn't exist and we have to be in court and we have to be dealing with it, or even a place like New York City when our local is insisting that as a baseline matter, and I think rightly so, and you see LA is trying to do that as well, right? Like, you know, that as a baseline matter, when you ultimately move to indoor, you have to do a baseline testing and randomized testing. It would be good if you could do what Donald Trump gets every day, which is everybody around him gets a test, but you have to at least have a baseline. You have to at least give people evidence. So it's not simply that they're not listened to. It is that lots and lots and lots of teachers, educators in particular, feel like even after everything they did to stand this up and to engage kids, they feel very expendable in the bigger fight over either if you're Trump pretending that COVID is in the rear view mirror, or if you are any of these local district superintendents or others who have not actually had a consistent ability to say, this is what we need to do and the resources to do it. You feel like you are basically being the ones who are told, just figure it out like you do every single year. And frankly, in a pandemic, you cannot figure it out like you do in every single year.
Yeah, you know, I think that's one of the kind of tragedies here that I see playing out again and again, right? We've got this kind of two sides of this historical coin, you know, and on one side of it, we've got teacher as savior, right? And we were there this spring, you know, with the parades and the parents like, take my kid. I'm so grateful for everything that you do. I can't possibly do it on my own any longer. Oh my goodness, the teachers are saving our country. But we flip so quickly to the other side of that coin, which is teacher as problem, you know, and as soon as we hear teachers talking about the resources they need, as soon as we hear teachers exercising that voice, we're so quick to kind of blame them as greedy and self-interested, right? And so when teachers are saying they need more resources, well, they're not thinking about what parents need, or they're not thinking about the politics of this whole thing, right? And it's stunning to me how quickly we can switch between those two places, you know. And I think what you said, Randi, on top of that, you know, I'm always thinking about what's the same, what's new over time. And I do think that there's a lot of this blame game that really feels familiar. But one of the things I think that also feels new is that in addition to heaping the blame on teachers, that our leaders are taking this opportunity to undermine our public schools so drastically with, this is why we need choice, right? You know, choice is hardly a new idea. And the research out there is pretty clear that it's worked okay for affluent parents and pretty poorly for everybody else. And yet, so teachers are now in this situation where they're kind of on the sidelines, waiting to see what school is going to look like, having to defend themselves, and also having to make the case for, you know, how schools are important in our society, which just feels like, my goodness, could we be doing more this September?
Yeah, I mean, but I do think you're getting to a point, Diana, about the whole issue of, does gender play a role in this blame game? Because this is what was so, you know, you pinpoint this in your book over and over again about these two sides of this coin, which is both savior and blamed at the same time. Like, if we can't figure everything out to make sure that everything works, then we're blamed that we're not understanding everybody else's priorities, or worse, we're blamed that we're failures. So because it's different than the way in which others get blamed. Like, they're not expected to be a savior, and if the standard of savior or martyr is not reached, then they're blamed. So unpack that from, you know, your perspective, from the scholar perspective. unpack that a little bit for us about why this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think Randi, you're right on it. I think the answer for me to that question starts with gender dynamics. You know, we can't think about teaching as if it's a neutral space, as if women haven't dominated the teaching ranks, and that as if teaching wasn't specifically imagined for women early on. You know, what I find and I write about in the book is that there are these deep-seated gendered assumptions and stereotypes of the female intellect and ability that were really inseparable from early discussions about what public schools ought to do, what public school teachers ought to be responsible for. And so as a result, even as gender norms have changed over time a bit, right? You know, women can vote, run for office, own property, of course, but those gendered ideals, you know, that women were nurturers and not leaders, that women were caretakers, not experts, right? That they are self-sacrificing. Those were baked into the structure of our public schools, of the way we do school today. And so when we're talking about how we control teachers and the expectations we have for them, it traces back to that. You know, Horace Mann was an early supporter, an early advocate of public education, 1850s. And he's also a key voice calling for women to come into the schools. And for him, one of his arguments that women are perfectly suited here because the school would be an extension of the home, right? And so in this formulation, we've got women being coveted as teachers, right? There's a lot of them who aren't doing it much else at that time, the early 1850s. They're cheap because they didn't have a whole lot of other professional options. And they would be good rule followers, folks thought. So, you know, but those same attributes, those same gendered ideals put women at the very bottom of the school hierarchy, where school leaders and policymakers reason that, you know, teachers could care for kids like a mother could, but not really make a whole lot of decisions about curriculum or instruction, right? And so that dynamic has played out again and again. You know, so how does that gender history lead to this history of blame? You know, I think that from the start, kind of fitting hand to glove is this idea that teachers are important but can't really be trusted, right? And so what we've seen is that bureaucracy grows around them, on top of them, right? And we're trying to regulate, standardized teachers. I have one quote in my book of a national leader talking about teacher proofing our schools. You know, so we put teachers in this convenient place where their voice has been minimized and their hands are tied. Right. Yeah. But then I think the other piece is that we ask a lot of our public schools, you know, and I think the least of what we ask our schools to do is to teach kids to read and to do math. You know, we're thinking about using our schools to address poverty, to address diversity and Americanization and social justice and bolstering the economy and international competition and on and on. And so tasks of that magnitude, for one, take investments, which we've not really been willing to do with public education. And so I think in a lot of ways, teachers are this convenient scapegoat that we can kind of point to, like, look, they haven't done it, even though this was an enormous task that was almost possibly impossible. So, yeah.
It's almost as if it is the role that we're asking teachers to do is so great, but we're not going to give them the power, the authority, the agency to do it. We have to handcuff them in lots of different ways because they actually are doing the most important role in society. I think, John, the Atlantic, I think it was Jonathan Beinart, had an article in the Atlantic magazine. And for those who are participating, Diana asked me to have like a real conversation with her about, you know, schooling and all of this, which is why this is not kind of like your normal ask the author, all these kind of conversations. We had decided in advance that we would have a real conversation about this, which is what she asked me to do for somebody who wrote in the chat. She wanted to hear from the author. So, but let me just say,
no, this is the hope.
No. So I just wanted to make sure that people knew that you and I had planned having a real conversation, which I really appreciate. But Jonathan Beinart had something in the Atlantic magazine a few months ago on this topic about women and how gendered that the misogyny of both hating women, keeping women in their place. You see this in authoritarian governments throughout the world, the hatred of women. But what did women do that made them so scary? Women are the people who can get pregnant. Women are the people who birth the next generation. So women were absolutely indispensable in terms of recreating a society. Yet if you listen to authoritarians, you see the hatred. It's not just the handmaiden's tale. You see it throughout history. And I think you're talking about, you see that in the both, first the teacher proofing, you have to leave teaching. If first it was, you have to leave teaching when you're pregnant, you have to leave teaching when you're married. Then, so the only people who can teach are the ones who are the most vulnerable. And then it was the teacher proofing, and then it was going through the script. And then in the last, 10, 20 years of so-called reform, it was testing, teaching to the test, and evaluating teachers based upon an algorithm and test scores, as if there was no real thought process to how do you meet the needs of children.
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes this conversation so complicated is that, so there is broad consensus that public schools are really important. And I think because of that consensus, so many people are engaged in the debate around it. And so not only do we have a lot of different ideas about what our public schools are for and how they can best function, but we also increasingly have a lot of individuals and industries that have a vested interest in the public schools, right? Folks who have built a career off of the public schools being structured the way that they are, off of this bureaucracy, and also off of blaming teachers, right? Both of the management of teachers and this idea that teachers aren't doing their job well enough. So we've seen politicians kind of make careers off of that discourse, but everything from textbook companies to test makers all have this kind of investment in this rhetoric that teachers can't be trusted to do it on their own. And so I think one of the surprises, right, when I'm reading a book, I'm always curious to know from the author, what did you find so surprising? And I think one of the things that surprised me is that, on one hand, we think of this word professionalism or professionalization as this kind of positive thing, and it is, and it built a lot of consensus, and it had widespread support because of all of its positive connotations. But for teachers historically, right, those policies that were offered, those reforms that were offered in the name of professionalization, in practicality, they hamstrung teachers, right? They limited their voice. They circumscribed their authority. And so, they never found an increase in stature or a real improvement in working conditions. So this vision of the professional teacher that policymakers and school leaders touted today, but also over time, was often a poor fit for how teachers understood professionalism, and certainly different from how other fields experience professionalism.
So, again, that is a really, we've been grappling with this, and our union, the AFT, has been grappling with this probably for as long as the AFT has been around, because it's, when you think about, so let me do two quick takes on this. When you think about the history of education in America, we have adopted a very Germanic model, and frankly, a very factory-based model. You think about high schools. You think about how 40 minutes in a class and you move, then 40 minutes a class and you move. You think about how classes all around the country look the same, even though education is really, really different around the country. Much of what is around the country, it comes from, the textbooks that are published for Texas because they have so many students. So you can go on and on with that. And yet the word professionalism is used a lot to try to regulate teachers. Be professional. It is professional for you to spend your lunchtime with your students. So it was used as a word of discipline as opposed to as a word of authority and a word of responsibility. What we have started to talk about is the freedom to teach, and that trying to figure out how do you negotiate within a scope of practice what the kind of authority and agency educators should have. And one of the ways of doing this is to actually negotiate, believe it or not, a no retaliation clause. And the reason I say that is because for us to be able to take risks within what we do, we need to actually make sure that you're not going to be retaliated against or penalized for actually taking that risk. And that is part of what every professional does. There's a scope of practice, there's a scope of authority, and there is an imputation that if you are using your authority to be reasonably and you're competent at doing that, you have that kind of scope to try things. What scientist doesn't try things in terms of trying to figure out how to cure cancer? And we are essentially scientists of the mind. We are essentially trying to figure out how do we meet children's needs, and every child is different. And so we may have some tools, but that's part of this ever advancing process in terms of teaching. Last thing I'll say about this is the irony about what happened in March is that those folks who actually had this freedom to teach, who actually did, for example, project-based learning, who actually had authority to focus on children's well-being, those are, when you talk to teachers all across the nation, the ones who actually had an easier time of things being moved to remote, when I say easier, felt more successful, are the ones who actually did project-based learning, the ones who actually met kids' well-being, the ones where there was already the kind of muscle of strategic thinking and thoughtfulness and mindfulness and wellness, and having that kind of flexibility. And I hope we do some research. I hope we have a new administration that enables us to do this research, but I hope we are going to be able to do this research so that the research hopefully shows what the anecdotal evidence have been thus far. And I think that will be very, very helpful in the future of re-envisioning what it means to teach and having the learning and the teaching condition and the freedom to teach to be able to meet the needs of kids.
Yeah, I think that's great, Randi. I mean, I think one of the themes that I find in the book and that really has jumped out to me now as I'm paying attention to COVID and reopening plans is how often we develop bureaucratic solutions to pedagogical problems, right? And this goes
Exactly
back
right.
to, right? This goes back to sort of what we were talking about at the beginning with teacher voice, right? Teachers have not been disinterested in leading these kinds of conversations, right? One of the things that I document in the book that I think is part of the tragedy here is teachers lots of times saying, hey, we'd like to try this thing. We'd like to do this thing. We want to explore this idea. And folks kind of like, no, this is, stay in your lane. That's not what we're trying to do here. And so, I think that for me, the root cause of the kinds of problems that we're talking about historically are structural and organizational. And so I think the solution has to be structural and organizational, so as long as we have teachers who can't find a minute for a bathroom break or a proper lunch, how do they have time to plan and collaborate and lead? And for me, I think that's by design. And it was interesting in talking.
So let me ask you this way.
Yeah.
You've spent a lot of time studying this. And we just started talking a little bit about solutions, and I know there's lots of participants' questions. But if you could rewrite those rules, bureaucracies, ordinances, whatever, Like, what ideas would you have right now to break this cycle?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to rethink this kind of bureaucratic organization of our schools. I think that teachers do need logistical support. But we need to hear from them about the resources that they need. We need to hear from them about what learning and teaching looks like. We need to hear from them about class size and innovation and experimentation. And then I think then we need our district leaders and our building leaders and our politicians to figure out how to make that happen. Right? I think in a lot of ways, we have a very backwards process here where we are telling teachers, this is what school looks like, and they are forced to enact that. And what happens for a lot of teachers know this, they close their door and they do the kind of innovation they want to do, right? We're seeing this historically. I know this is true now. But then at the end of the day, even as they've done these passion projects and they're trying out these exciting things, they still have to have their kids take that same standardized test. So they're kind of just in this bind there. So I think this is not really a matter of, let's include teachers in the decision-making process. Let's get a teacher representative on a committee. I think it really is. If we say we want professional teachers, are we ready to defer to teacher expertise on what it means, on what teacher education looks like, on what the structure of teachers' work lives look like, on whether there's a teacher ladder? Right now, for a teacher to advance in the profession, they have to leave it, right? They come in and they're a teacher on day 1 and they're a teacher on year 20, right? And this is something I know the union has played around with for a long time. So I think there's lots of things like that. But again, one of the things that I see in the book is that so much of the reform has been in the name of increasing efficiency and safeguarding that bureaucracy. So these kinds of changes, there's a lot of opposition to it. But I do think if we're serious about wanting a pathway for change, there certainly is one.
It's like done to us instead of done with us.
Yeah.
And, our teacher leader program, and I know they want us to ask, the audience wants to ask, the Zoom audience wants to ask questions, but there is an ability, or there's an opportunity here. And one of the things that we've done at the AFT is we've created this teacher leader program because distributive leadership is really important, but it has to be from a place where people feel real authority and real agency. Yes, with authority comes responsibility, and we have to figure out how to do that in terms of shared decision-making and collaboration, and we haven't even talked about any of that. But there is real opportunity here, given how do you reimagine what schools look like, how important in-person learning is, how important schools are in terms of central to community, how important community schools and well-being is right now, particularly with 3 crises at our footsteps, and how important schooling and teachers are going to be to help get us out of this level playing field and recreate skills and knowledge and wherewithal and well-being and opportunity for a next generation.
Yeah.
Preach at 100%. Absolutely. We have some really informed, wonderful questions that I wanted to pose to you guys. Abraham asks, thanks for your amazing book. I'm in the midst of it right now, currently working in the education field. Can you speak about teachers as public sector employees engaged in public service and how that idea has been part of the dialogue and discussion over the history of reform and professionalization? And then he says, and forgive me if this comes later in the book and I just haven't gotten there.
No, it's a great question. Thank you so much. And thank you for reading the book and joining in tonight. That means just more to me than I can say. I think that the fact that teachers are public sector employees creates extra complication here. And Randy and I were talking about this a little bit ago. And I think because public schools are supported by tax dollars, right? Everybody feels that they have a sense of entitlement over what that looks like. And we have very different views, not just as a community, right? But geographically, across time, we have really different ideas. And, folks aren't really compartmentalized with one view here, right? So, some of us need our schools for daycare so we can go to work, right? This is a critical thing. Some of us need schools because they are important services that our kids rely on, from nutrition to special education services and everything in between, and some of us want, I don't know, this sort of a more academic, but and not, these aren't compartmentalized. It's not like we have one camp that just wants this and one camp that wants another. And so teachers are kind of beholden to all of these different views. And I think it affects teachers more than I think some other public sector employees, because the nature of the organization of the profession has kind of put them, first of all, at the very bottom, but at a place where we've kind of legitimized this kind of blaming and questioning.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have two questions, and they're kind of interlinking, but their own question. But let's start with Amber, who's very eager to have her question answered. Thanks for this conversation. Particularly in this moment of heightened racial tensions, can you both speak to how educators have advocated and intervened to address racial injustice in our schools historically? They often have had to navigate structural barriers and personal discomfort when doing so, especially teachers of color.
That's a great question. Thank you, Amber. And if it's the Amber I'm thinking of, thank you for being here and asking it. I would say one of the, there's a big answer here. And I would say one of the first things that comes to my mind is that, I think we tend to think of things these compartmentalized ways, right? As if we are either dealing with the health and safety of kids around COVID, and we have the social justice thing, right? And I don't see those as two separate issues. I think that they are very much one and the same. These are both pandemics. One has been around much longer than the other, maybe just as deadly. But, when we think about, who's going to school in overcrowded classrooms, who finds themselves in schools that are in need of new ventilation systems, and on, I think we find a huge overlap with also the kids and families who find themselves disproportionately affected by racism and police violence. And, historically, it's been a complicated story. I would say that just as gender has been baked into the organization of schools, so have racialized and racist ideas, right? So, so schools have not always been a lever for social justice and change. Teachers have not always been fighting for that. Many times they have. And the book talks about that, but also sometimes teachers have been barriers to that change because they've understood or they've had competing ideas about the goals of the schools. And so I don't think there's a single lesson. I think what history tells us is that there's been a long history. There have been teachers who have been fighting for justice almost always. Sometimes that makes its way into the mainstream. The union picks it up and it gets way more momentum. And sometimes those teachers find themselves fighting on the margins on their own. I think we have a real moment right now to fuse those in a really powerful way and to fight for the health of our children and the social justice for our children in a unified kind of way. I don't know, Randy, if you have thoughts about that.
So look, we're the union that actually expelled our segregated locals and lost a lot of members. And I think, as people started talking about expelling police unions from the AFL, first, there's actually only one police union that's in the AFL. Most of the ones who spoke at the convention, the Republican convention, are not members of the AFL because they don't actually believe in what the AFL believes in. But we actually expelled our segregated locals for all the reasons that I'm sure Amber and others would talk about today, which are as frightening and as frustrating today as they were years ago, because there isn't a level playing field in the United States. There is a lot of structural racism, and there has been since with all of the discrimination that our country did first to Native Americans, and then by enslaving Black Americans, and then all the other Jim Crow lynching and Jim Crow, all of which doesn't get taught nearly enough in a way that is open-minded enough to really, really wrestle with these issues that and in a way that opens things up. And this is a moment and an opportunity long-term to be able to do that. But first and foremost, people have to feel pain and have to feel the pain. And look, even just the three of us, we're all white. What is the pain of not being able to walk on a street and know that you will be safe? The pain of being of knowing that you have to have a conversation with your Black son. This is something that I think that those of us who are white, we have to understand and the pain of discrimination. And I think that we don't do that often enough, and we don't do that in a way that is humble enough. And that's part of what's going on right now. So what we've tried to do as a union now is not to say simply, oh, look what we did a while ago. We are trying to do things like really focus on teacher diversity. In our new budget, we have said every training that we do in terms of the union, we will make sure we have anti-racism training baked into this. We're going to try to do, not just say, oh, woe is me, this is terrible, but how do we ourselves change so that we are making sure anti-racist training is baked into everything and an anti-racist lens is baked into everything. And that's what we're trying to do now and what we will try to do in the future.
Thank you. Another question. My district encourages teachers to lead from their seat. This is not often explained, but is implied to mean that we should be leaders, but we shouldn't get too far ahead of ourselves. We have our place, and thus the district says we need to lead, but we should only be leading in a sanctioned way. Have you heard about this in other districts? Do you see this kind of rhetoric as helpful or hurtful to teachers? I think that's hurtful.
I mean, how many double messages could that be? You know, speak up, take risks, but not really. Like, how do you do that? That's why I said at the beginning, one of the things that we've tried to do in terms of negotiating is to actually have some kind of no retaliation language to create a way in which people can take risks. Obviously, risks within a circumference of responsibility, but that is a double message where, you know, what are you saying? What are you really saying? You're saying, be a miracle worker, do whatever you can to meet the needs of students, you know, but if I don't like what you've done, I'm gonna pull you back and I'm gonna undermine it. Yeah. How many people have the spine or to be able to do that? And how disrespectful is that as a strategy?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. Yeah, it's a trap. Yeah.
It is a trap, you know, and I think what we see too is that what we tell teachers time and again, and I write about this in the book, is that go and do this, lead this, be the savior here, but also do this with a number of kids that we've told you need to take on, and teach this curriculum in the way that we've told you, and give this assessment at the end that you have not decided, that is not based on knowledge that you have decided is important. You know, so it really, teachers find themselves in this impossible position, right? And so many teachers come to the work and stay in the work because they truly are passionate about it. And so I think that there's a deep frustration here that is a really important part of the story.
Right, absolutely.
And take a class with Diana, by the way. Before we end, I would just want to say that it is just, I know there's a couple more questions, but I want to just say, you know, this is what Diana is preaching. You know, this is the best of teacher prep. This is the kind of stuff of real thoughtful, amazing. Somebody is saying, one of your admirers, Diana, is saying, yes, Diana is an amazing professor. But it's just, you know, unshackle people. Let them teach. Let us do the work that people want to do. Let us be free to teach in ways that are meaningful. Let us be free to preach about social justice and that equivalent means equivalent and equitable means equitable. Let us fight for the resources so that every child has that shot. Between us and parents, we are the ones who are closest to children and to their future and to enabling them to have that future. And I think that the kind of thoughtfulness that Diana put into this book and the way in which she, you know, I'd be lucky and we'd all be lucky to take courses from her. But I want to say one more pitch to everybody, even with everything that's going on, teach. It is still one of the most important, not only professions in this nation, not only jobs in this nation, but if we want to have a nation, we need a generation of teachers who are going to do what they need to do to help kids thrive.
Yeah. I want to hop in there too. I sense, there's a lot going on right now in 2020 that gives us pause and makes us kind of just, but I gotta say, I also find a lot to be optimistic about. I find in this moment, the conversations that we're having and the clear intersections that we're having in these discussions to be different than what I've seen historically, that I think that really holds a lot of hope for change, for what our schools look like, for the role of teachers, and all of this is riding off the wave of teacher activism that we've seen over the last few years. And so I think it is a great time to be a teacher, but I think it's also a great time to push back on those rules and not to accept those. Yeah.
This is a bit of a turn, but Angela wants to know, what role do teacher preparation programs, four-year college programs, or alternatives certificate programs play in this problem?
Yeah, I mean, so that's something I write a lot about in the book. And, teacher education programs are another important part of the piece of the puzzle. And they also find themselves constrained in a lot of ways, in ways that other areas of the university are not constrained. So, we think about the professional preparation of doctors and lawyers. We're not so worried about how long it's going to take because they're going to go into a field and make loads of money and repay their debt for the most part. For teachers, though, when they go into the schools, they're making significantly less than a lot of other fields. So we're also immediately thinking about not just what do teachers need to know and be able to do, but how can we give that to them in the quickest way possible, which is enormously complicated. And I would say just as teachers find themselves under lots of different areas of criticism and control, teacher education does too. Increasingly, I think, teacher education finds it in this really confused place where there are some folks saying we need alternate pathways. We need to depart from what the university is doing. And some want traditional programs, and we want an add-on year or an undergraduate program. And sort of teacher educators are spinning around, right? Trying to be everything for everybody. But I think again, with this conversation of how do we make change, I think a teacher-led conversation about what does our professional preparation need? What is it that we need to know before we get into the classroom? And I think there are a lot of partners there. I think that teacher educators want to be partners in that project with teachers, with union leaders. And I think right now it's a matter of shifting the nature of those conversations.
And maybe every teacher needs also a copy of your book. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's really, it's, a while ago, a few years ago, we did a task force with K-12 teachers and teachers who taught teachers in higher education. And it was really interesting to watch the evolution of that task force from being, and they were all AFT members, but being tense with each other initially about each other's autonomy,
right,
to ultimately getting to a meeting of the minds about what we needed to do to help people be successful. There's a practice area, there's a content area, there's all sorts of other, there's issues around ensuring cultural competency. There's lots of things that we need to do. And there was lots, and ultimately at the end of the day, one saw that the higher ed professionals saw that the K-12 folk weren't saying to them, no, don't do what your passion is. And the K-12 folk were seeing that the higher ed folk really wanted teachers to be successful. But that gets back to how we went from blaming each other to collaborating and working with each other. And I think that getting those voices involved and feeling the agency to do this is part of what we need to do long term. Like every teacher college should actually have a group of currently working educators who give advice that gets infused into a teacher preparation program. So that may be one of the ways of doing that. But we need teacher preparation programs, and we need more professors like Diana.
Well, talking about collaboration, we have time for one more question. And there were so many wonderful questions. I'm sorry we can't get to them all. But I did want to take this question about parents from Bonnie. And obviously it's top of mind for many of us, for whom kind of the veil of what teachers do has been kind of lifted over the past months. And, you know, we want to support. And Bonnie asks, parents and guardians may finally be recognizing the critical role of teachers, especially now that they're personally experiencing the intricacies of daily classroom teaching and learning. And then really the question is, how can they harness it into advocacy for policy and systemic reforms? And, you know, how can they best support teachers at this moment in time?
I mean, one of the things that I have seen over when I think about this long history is that the times when teachers have been most have been able to leverage the most change, right, and harness the most change is when they have formed these kind of grassroots coalitions between you know, teachers, unions, community organizations, and parents. And when they join together to really imagine what could schools look like? What are schools for in our community? That's when I think we see some really promising things. So I think that is another place where we could really be hopeful about change. So, you know, advice there, what do parents do? I would say, you know, this is not, I think it's a mistake to organize in separate blocks, right? Like there's the parent group about what we want, and then there's the teacher group and administrators. I think it's to form those coalitions, to get together with teachers and to think about how do we support one another in mutual ways. I think that would be my thought there. Yeah.
When teachers and parents are together, it's a really, really powerful coalition, and it's unbeatable. And you saw that in the work that you see in my union and also in the NEA. A lot of our locals are really thinking about how to bargain for the common good, meaning how to really think about bargaining as how do I improve teaching and learning for our kids. Teachers want what children need is not simply a slogan. It is actually, if you see a successful school district, it's because you're seeing that administrators and the public see that closely. But it takes work to overcome what is natural tension sometimes because people start from different vantage points. And it really takes a close collaborative relationship, and sometimes actually sitting there and listening to the pain that people have felt. One person asked a question before about pain in terms of social justice there, and Diana said at points people don't do the right things. You have to get through that pain in order to actually create trust. Trust is earned. It's not just there magically. But when teachers and parents work together and walk in each other's shoes and understand each other and understand their very complementary roles in our children's lives, then they have each other's back, the likes of because no one else does. And they then can actually make things happen. So I'm a big believer in that, but you gotta earn it and you gotta spend the time listening to each other.
Well, it's been a pleasure listening to both of you tonight. Thank you so much. Please buy Diana's book, stay well, and stay well read, and vote. And thank you all. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Randy.
Thank you, Diana. And thank you, Politics and Prose.
Yeah,
Always.
thank you.